Hi everyone, this is Julianne Johnston. Today I'll be introducing my developmental learning design project in which participants will learn how to plant a flower in a pot. The developmental age groups for this learning design are early childhood learners ages 3 to 5 and middle to late childhood learners ages 6 to 11. For purposes of this specific design, I chose to particularly focus on ages 6 to 8. This will take place in an informal learning environment in that learning that occurs is not formally recognized by any certifications. Learning is self-directed and collective. It's an appropriate learning environment because the gardens offer 150 acres of landscape-themed gardens, including an herb, desert, rose, and Asian gardens. In addition to this, there is an urban agriculture space that helps gardeners and researchers make connections to the region's history for educators and families. This will be a one-time workshop lasting 1 hour to 90 minutes. The outcomes for this learning design for both age groups will be to align connections between seed and plant, specifically how to articulate that seeds turn into plants. The learner will also be able to list environmental needs for plants to grow, and the learners will increase their belief and value that plants are a valuable aspect of nature that helps the environment and people. The required prior knowledge for both groups of learners are basic language skills, the ability to connect concepts and ideas to verbally show proof of learning, and to know that most plants and trees start from seeds and have environmental needs to sustain growth. Particularly for the middle childhood learners, they are expected to know basic writing skills to document the new knowledge. In order to assess prior knowledge, for early childhood learners, I will conduct a full group discussion to ask them to verbally make prior knowledge-based predictions about new information before they encounter it. Through oral conversations, I will use group brainstorming to begin a Know, Wonder, Learn, a KWL activity to reveal prior knowledge. The KWL is an activity that takes place throughout the learning task to collect ideas from the group of learners to show what they already know, prior knowledge, what they wonder, making predictions, and to prove what they learned afterward, assessment. For the middle to late childhood learners ages 6 to 8, I plan to assess their prior knowledge by utilizing their long-term memory skills to ask more advanced questions. Questions such as where do plants come from, what are the names of some of the parts of a flower, and what do plants need to grow. Knowing what information the learners already possess will guide my lesson while also guiding their learning to prepare them for any new information. For the early childhood learners, I will gather them in the teaching greenhouse space within the museum gardens. Due to this age group being very young and having little to no experience of their very young age and little to no experience in a school or class setting, an adult chaperone or parent will accompany each child. Our first segment of the lesson will be a visit to the urban agriculture ranch that is located on site. While on site in the garden, the 3 to 4-year-olds will be introduced to the botanical staff that oversee and maintain the garden space. They'll get to see, touch, and smell various vegetables and herbs such as tomatoes, lettuces, lavender, carrots, citrus, and pomegranates. After the visit to the garden, the learners will walk back to the teaching greenhouse, and I'll read aloud to the group The Tiny Seed by Eric Carle. This book was carefully selected as it illustrates the life of a seed told through the viewpoint of one particular seed carried by the wind to finally land in a perfect place to plant and grow until it produces seeds of its own. To reinforce the new information learned from their visit to the garden and after hearing the story by Eric Carle, the full group will be split into 2 separate smaller groups to complete the next 2 activities. The first group of early learners will be given a coloring sheet and crayons to complete a coloring sheet illustrating the life cycle of seed to plant and the environmental needs it requires to sustain life. Simultaneously, the second group of early learners will participate in an adult-assisted, hands-on activity to fill a pot with soil, select a flower, a marigold or sunflower seed, to plant in the soil and add water. Because of the early learners' limited mastery of motor skills, an adult chaperone is required to oversee and assist during this activity. The small groups within the early learners class will have an opportunity to switch so that the first group will be able to do the planting and the second group will complete their plant life cycle coloring sheet. Each student will be able to take home both their activity and planted seed. To wrap up the KWL activity, I will ask the group questions such as, what have we learned that plants need in order to live, and what will you do when you take your plant home? Similar to the previous developmental group, the middle to late learners ages 6 to 8 will also begin their learning activity by going to the teaching greenhouse space within the museum gardens. They too will visit the urban agriculture garden that is located on site in the museum gardens. Through discussion with the botanical staff and curators in the garden, the learners will be introduced to new vocabulary such as environment, compost, and nutrients. After the visit to the garden, the group will walk back to the teaching greenhouse classroom where they'll be split into 2 groups. The first group will create their own illustration of the life cycle of a seed to plant and discuss the necessary elements for plants to sustain. This activity is made up of pre-cut shapes that need to be aligned in a correct order and glued using glue sticks. This activity reinforces how all of these elements work together to help the plant grow. The second group of learners will participate in a hands-on activity to fill a pot with soil, select a marigold or sunflower seed to plant in the soil, and add water. Learners in this developmental age group are able to listen to instructions and complete a task or activity without much guided assistance during the hands-on learning. Therefore, this group is expected to comprehend verbal instructions as to where to find the necessary garden supplies such as a pot, trowel, soil, flour, and water, and complete the activities without direct guidance and assistance from an adult. The small groups within the middle childhood learners will switch activities so that each student will have an opportunity to participate in both the planting and the life cycle activity. Each student will be able to take home their activity and planted seed. And to wrap up this KWL activity, I'll ask this group questions such as, what have we learned that plants need in order to live? What will you do when you take your plants home? For the early childhood learners, I'll observe during the group discussion and story reading. This formative assessment will monitor the learner's attention to the story and information being presented, whether the group is engaged in the learning. Referring back to the initial discussion of the KWL, I'll continue the discussion to reflect on what was learned. What do seeds and plants need in order to grow, and what will you do when you take your planted flower home? This reflection segment of the learning project will help me assess transfer of knowledge for the learners. It will also help guide the evaluation process. For the middle childhood learners, I'll observe during the visit to the urban garden and the conversation in the teaching greenhouse classroom. I'll assess if the students were freely engaged. Did they ask questions to further the discussion? This will show a level of interest and curiosity on the information being presented. To encourage effective transfer of knowledge, I'll give students opportunities to apply skills or knowledge in diverse contexts, for example, suggesting they can do the same activity with other seeds and flowers at home. To assess value, I'll ask the students questions such as, what activities can you do to help the environment, and how will you take care of your planted seed at home? By repeating and recapping the information many times, this will help me assess successful transfer of knowledge. It will also help guide the evaluation process in order to build an exportable model to be used in future program planning. Thanks for listening.